For centuries, the story of human evolution was simpler, so we thought. Homo sapiens, the modern human, emerged in Africa, spread across the globe, and eventually replaced all other archaic humans. Clean, linear, triumphant. We believed we stood alone, the final and most advanced branch of the evolutionary tree. But the truth hidden within the spirals of our DNAs, far messier and far more fascinating. Buried in the double helix of every non-African human lies a trace of something ancient, something once believed to be gone forever, whispers of another kind of human, the Neanderthals. Once cast as brutish cavemen, primitive, slow, and doomed to extinction, Neanderthals were written off as nature's failed experiment, separate from us, inferior. But science has a way of rewriting stories. And now, the genetic evidence tells us something astonishing. Neanderthals didn't vanish without a trace. They became part of us. Modern genomic research has revealed that up to 2% of the DNA in most people of European and Asian descent comes from Neanderthals. This is not a metaphor. It's a measurable, biological fact. We carry their genes in our immune systems, in the way we process fat, even in how we respond to certain medications today. And this fact shakes the very foundation of how we define us versus them. The myth of a pure Homo sapiens lineage unmixed, untouched has collapsed under the weight of ancient DNA. The reality is that when Homo sapiens stepped into Ice Age Europe tens of thousands of years ago, they didn't just compete with Neanderthals, they lived with them, learned from them, and yes-mated with them. This is the story that's been hidden in our blood all along. A story not of domination, but of contact, not of extinction alone, but of interbreeding, absorption, and genetic inheritance. This is the real tale of what happened when Homo sapiens met Neanderthal sand, how their legacy still echoes in every breath we take. For much of the 20th century, the dominant view of human evolution was elegantly simplistic, as it turns out, profoundly incomplete. Known as the out-of-Africa theory, it proposed that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago and eventually spread across the globe, replacing all other archaic human species like Homo erectus, Denisovans, and Neanderthals. According to this view, we didn't mingle, we conquered. Homo sapiens were believed to be a genetically isolated pure species superior in intelligence, technology, and adaptability. But science rarely stands still, and in the past 2 decades, revolutionary advances in genetic sequencing have forced us to rethink nearly everything. From the soil of ancient caves to the calcified remains of bones buried for tens of thousands of years, scientists began extracting fragments of ancient DNA molecular time capsules preserved in teeth, in bones, in the dust of prehistory. What they found wasn't just unexpected, it was world-shattering. Neanderthal DNA was not confined to fossils, it was living within us. Studies revealed that people of European and Asian descent carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This was not an anomaly, it was a signature, a legacy of ancient encounters that could no longer be denied. These findings proved, beyond reasonable doubt, that interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occurred not just once, but multiple times, in different regions. And yet, there's a haunting irony. Not long after these encounters, Neanderthals vanished. Their disappearance followed Homo sapiens' arrival into Europe like a long, fading shadow. It raises a question that scientists and philosophers alike still grapple with. Was this true replacement? Or was it something more nuanced, slow absorption, a merging of bloodlines, a quiet fading rather than a violent end? What we thought was a tale of extinction is now a story of interwoven destiny of 2 species, meeting not just in conflict, but in connection. And the truth? It's far more complex than we ever imagined. Imagine this. The entire Neanderthal species, every man, woman, and child, could have fit inside a single sports stadium. At their peak, scientists estimate there were no more than 70,000 Neanderthals living on Earth at any given time. That's not a continent, it's a crowd, and not a very big one. While Homo sapiens eventually grew into millions across multiple continents, the Neanderthals remained few and fragmented. They lived in small, isolated groups scattered throughout Ice Age, Europe, and parts of Western Asia tribes, often numbering in the dozens, sometimes only a handful. These weren't cities. These were survival units clinging to life in a world that rarely showed mercy. The frigid climates of the Pleistocene tested every living thing, and Neanderthals faced it head-on with remarkable endurance. But biology is ruthless in its mathematics. In populations so small, even the slightest imbalance in birth and death rates, just a few too many children not surviving, a few too many hunters lost in accidents or disease can tip a species into terminal decline. This is what scientists call the extinction vortex, a feedback loop where a small population becomes even smaller, more vulnerable to inbreeding, less genetically diverse, and increasingly unable to recover from shocks, be they environmental, social, or biological. And Neanderthals were likely caught in that very spiral. They may not have vanished because they were weak or unintelligent. They may have vanished because, statistically, they were always living on the edge. Their extinction may have been written not in violence, but in the cruel calculus of population dynamics. So the question becomes more tragic and more profound, not simply, why did they disappear, but rather, could they have ever survived at all? In a world changing faster than they could adapt, and with Homo sapiens on the rise, was the fate of the Neanderthals less of a mystery and more of a biological inevitability? For decades, the extinction of the Neanderthals was blamed on violence, climate change, or competition with Homo sapiens. But what if the answer wasn't on the battlefield or in the ice? What if it was hidden deep within their own biology? A new hypothesis has emerged from the cutting edge of paleogenetics, and it's as subtle as it is devastating. It suggests that the slow decline of the Neanderthals may have been driven not by conquest, but by compromised reproduction. Some researchers now believe that Neanderthal females may have had significantly lower fertility than their Homo sapiens counterparts, especially at younger ages. Their reproductive window might have started later or been shorter. In a species already numbering so few, even a modest drop in fertility could have tragic consequences over generations. But even more intriguing and more troubling is what may have happened when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did interbreed. Hybrid children were born. That much is certain. We see the genetic footprints today. But mounting evidence suggests that many of the male offspring, those born of mixed Neanderthal and Homo sapiens parents, may have been sterile. Like mules, the hybrids of horses and donkeys, they were unable to reproduce. Their genetic legacy stopped with them. This would have created an evolutionary bottleneck. Only female hybrids could have passed Neanderthal DNA forward. And that's exactly what we see today. Scattered fragments of Neanderthal genetic code in modern humans, primarily in non-reproductive regions of the genome, and often inherited through the maternal line. This silent failure of the male lineage may explain why Neanderthal DNA didn't flood into the Homo sapiens gene pool. It trickled in through narrow genetic doorways preserved only by chance and only through women. If true, this paints a haunting picture, not of a species wiped out in war, but of one whose bloodlines quietly failed to reproduce. A genetic vanishing act, not because of who they were, but because of what their DNA wouldn't allow. One of the most telling clues in the search for our ancient origins lies in the tiniest of places, within a single strand of DNA passed exclusively from father to son, the Y chromosome. For decades, geneticists have scoured modern human genomes, looking for any trace of Neanderthal Y DNA, kind that would have been carried by males and passed down across generations. But what they found was silence. Not a whisper, not a fragment. The Neanderthal Y chromosome, it seems, has vanished entirely from modern humanity. This absence isn't just surprising, it's evolutionary thunder. It strongly supports the theory that male hybrids, those born from the union of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, were often infertile, unable to reproduce. Genetic dead ends. It's a phenomenon not unfamiliar in nature. When two species diverge just enough to create offspring, but not enough to ensure those offspring are fertile, nature draws a hard line. Think of mules, the offspring of horses and donkeys, strong, capable, but always sterile. The Neanderthal-human hybrids may have followed the same rule, born of two close species, but reproductively broken. This genetic roadblock explains a great deal. It shows us why, despite clear evidence of interbreeding, the influence of Neanderthals in modern humans remains minimal. Their DNA is there, yes, but scattered, diluted, and most often inherited through maternal lines. In other words, the Neanderthal legacy lives on, but only in half shadows. We carry pieces of them in our immune systems, our skin, our metabolism. But the line of Neanderthal fathers ended long ago. Their voice in our genetic chorus is quiet, because it was silenced through male sterility. This, then, is not a mystery solved by fossil bones or ancient weapons, but by the elegant language of base pairs. In a single chromosome missing from our ancestry, we find the hidden boundary between two species zone that mingled, merged, and then faded. If hybrid males, those born of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens parents, were sterile, does that mean they were evolutionary failures? Nature might say yes, but culture tells another story. Sterility meant they couldn't pass on their genes, but genes aren't the only way humans shape the future. These hybrid individuals may have stood at the very crossroads of two species, biologically unique, physically distinct, possibly different in voice, strength, or even emotional expression. And yet, they walked the same landscapes, hunted the same mammoths, slept beneath the same stars. They couldn't create lineages, but they could forge connections. Perhaps they became scouts bridging the gaps between human and Neanderthal tribes. Perhaps they learned to interpret two cultures, two ways of thinking. Perhaps they carried knowledge across genetic boundaries, acting as living translators between two worlds. They may have hunted with Homo sapiens while remembering the ways of their Neanderthal kin. They may have taught younger generations how to track, to build shelters, to read the wind. They may have been storytellers woven into the fabric of early human society, respected not for what they could pass down biologically, but for what they preserved intellectually and spiritually. In tribal communities, knowledge was survival, and these hybrid men caught between worlds may have carried unique wisdom, unmatched perspective. They were not broken links. They were bridges. This silent dead end of inheritance doesn't erase them. It reframes them. These men were more than missed genetic opportunities. They were moments of union made flesh. Breathing proof that ancient humans didn't just fight. They mingled. They experimented. They tried to understand. Their very existence challenges the idea that species are rigid walls. Instead, they suggest something more human. That even tens of thousands of years ago, we were already exploring not just new lands but new forms of identity. In a way, these sterile hybrids may have played one of the most profound roles of all, serving as living reminders that contact, not conquestus, what reshaped the future of human evolution. As the Ice Age tightened its grip on Europe, the Neanderthals retreated slowly, stubbornly, and silently into the northern shadows of the continent. Archaeological evidence suggests that in their final millennia, they concentrated in what is now northern Germany and across parts of western Eurasia, clinging to the last fragments of their once vast territory. Between 60,000 and 43,000 years ago, they reached their peak population, if one can call it that. Even then, they likely numbered fewer than 70,000 individuals globally, scattered across a brutal landscape of tundra, forests, and frozen valleys. But for a time, they held on. They built tools, hunted game, and carried with them a culture forged in cold and survival. And then Homo sapiens arrived. With smaller bodies, broader diets, and sharper tools, our ancestors moved fast. They brought not just weapons, but cooperation, larger social networks, division of labor, and the ability to innovate in the face of changing conditions. They made fishhooks, tailored clothing, and shared information between tribes. They weren't just adapted to their environment, they could adapt their environment to them. To the Neanderthals, this may have been an overwhelming tide. Their groups were more isolated, their innovations slower to spread, their social circles tighter and more fragmented. In a harsh Ice Age world, those disadvantages were not minor, they were fatal. Climate shifts didn't help. The cold grew colder, the prey grew scarcer, and every setback, disease, starvation, injury hit harder when you had fewer people to begin with. It wasn't war. It wasn't plague. It wasn't one catastrophic event. It was erosion. The gradual wearing down of a population hemmed in by environment, outpaced by a more socially dynamic rival, and weakened by time itself. Because in evolution, survival isn't always about strength or size. It's about flexibility, about changing when the world demands it. And in that silent contest between resilience and reinvention, Homo sapiens bent where Neanderthals broke. Homo sapiens didn't conquer the world with brute strength alone, they brought something far more powerful, adaptability fueled by culture. They weren't just better hunters or stronger warriors, they were better communicators, better problem solvers, better at living together. Their communities were woven with symbolic language, shared belief systems, and stories passed from firelight to firelight. They painted visions on cave walls. They buried their dead with ritual. They crafted tools not only for survival but for expression. And they ate almost everything. Unlike Neanderthals, who relied heavily on large game and high-protein diets, Homo sapiens embraced variety. They gathered plants, fished rivers, roasted roots. Their culinary flexibility became a survival strategion that let them endure when meat ran scarce or seasons turned harsh. They built language networks not just to shout orders, but to share ideas across generations. They organized into larger groups, formed alliances, and traded knowledge across vast landscapes. They could coordinate hunts, plan migrations, and teach abstract concepts. In short, they could scale civilization before civilization even had a name. Neanderthals, for all their strengths, were built differently. Literally, their bodies were stockier, with powerful limbs designed for cold weather. Their eyes were larger, perhaps suited for twilight hunting or reading shadows in dense forests. Their noses, broader and more pronounced, helped warm frozen air. They were tough, no doubt, survivors of brutal climates and scarred terrain. But in a changing world, toughness isn't enough. Because evolution doesn't hand out trophies for whose strongest, it favors those who adapt. And Homo sapiens? They adapted everything. Their tools, their food, their ideas, themselves. The hidden history of human evolution isn't one of domination. It's the story of transformation, of a species that could reinvent its behavior faster than the world could break it. In the long game of survival, change is the ultimate advantage. And Homo sapiens mastered it. For generations, Neanderthals were dismissed as primitive brutes, half-human shadows wandering the frozen forests of prehistory. They were caricatured as knuckle-dragging savages doomed to extinction, lacking the spark of modern intelligence. But the deeper we dig into the archaeological record, the more that myth crumbles. Far from being mindless, Neanderthals were capable of deep, symbolic thought. They buried their dead sometimes with flowers, sometimes with red ochre pigments, gestures that suggest mourning, memory, and maybe even spiritual belief. They crafted necklaces and ornaments from eagle talons, objects with no practical purpose beyond decoration. That's art. That's identity. And in the darkness of caves, Neanderthals painted, With ochre and charcoal, they left mark symbols, handprints, perhaps Storian stone walls that still echo with the mystery of their minds. These aren't the actions of beasts. They're the rituals of beings who dreamed, who remembered, who imagined things that were not. Even their tools' complex stone blades, spears, scrapers show a sophisticated understanding of materials and design. There is growing evidence that Neanderthals had the capacity for spoken language, too maybe not as fluid or abstract as ours, but communication that could pass knowledge, emotion, and warning from one generation to the next. Their brains, after all, were as large as ours, in some cases larger. So perhaps the greatest secret of Neanderthal DNA isn't just that we interbred with them, but that we understood them. That when our ancestors met Neanderthals, they didn't see monsters. They saw echoes of themselves. Fellow humans different, yes, but not alien, not other. Maybe they shared stories under the stars. Maybe they grieved the same losses. Maybe, for a brief moment in deep time, two kinds of humans looked into each other's eye sand, saw something undeniably familiar. Not competition, but kinship. And perhaps, in that recognition, our evolutionary story truly began to shift from species divided to humanity shared. In the end, the story of human evolution isn't as clean as we once thought. It isn't a straight line. It's not Homo sapiens replacing everything that came before. It's not one species ascending while the others vanish into dust. It's messier, more beautiful, more human. Modern science, genetics, archaeology, anthropology has begun to challenge the very definition of what it means to be a species. Traditionally, species were defined by reproductive isolation. If two groups couldn't produce fertile offspring, they were considered separate. But what if they could? What if Homo sapiens and Neanderthals weren't separate species at all? If they lived together, created children, especially fertile daughter sand, passed on knowledge, rituals, and ways of life, then perhaps the wall that once divided us was never really there. They made tools like ours. They shared caves with us. They possibly even buried their dead beside ours. They sang the same survival songs in different tongues. They weren't just our neighbors in geography, they were kin in biology and perhaps in soul. And yet, textbooks long insisted that they were them and we were us, that Neanderthals were a side path, a failed branch, extinct. But look closer. We see their influence not just in fossils, but in our very bodies, in our immune systems, primed by Neanderthal adaptations to ancient pathogens, in the way some of us store fat, feel pain, metabolize starches, or even breathe at high altitudes. These are not Homo sapiens traits alone. They are inherited gifts from our distant Neanderthal ancestors, encoded in our DNA like whispers from the deep past. To define a species by bones alone is to ignore the living story unfolding inside every cell. It's to miss the way culture, reproduction, and memory cross invisible borders. It's to deny the full, tangled legacy of who we are. Because the truth is, Neanderthals never truly disappeared. They live on in using fragments of code, in inherited strengths, in the spark of ancient memory that makes us more than a single species. They were not extinguished. They were folded into the future, into us. And perhaps that is the greatest twist of all. That extinction is not always a vanishing, but sometimes a merging, a quiet survival beneath the surface. We are not pure. We are not singular. We are living archives of deep time. We are Homo sapiens. But we are also a little bit Neanderthal. If this journey through hidden history stirred your curiosity, don't forget to subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, the place where ancient humans come alive and evolutionary secrets are